Welcome back to Tutoring with Tiana. Today we are going to be talking about factoring quadratics with a leading coefficient of 1. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. Okay, for our factoring with quadratics, there are 4 cases that we can fall into, or like 4 buckets that we need to think about. The first bucket is when we have something like x squared plus bx plus c. So we just have addition between. And then another case would be x squared minus bx plus c. So the thing that links these two are the fact that we have pluses at the very end, like our constant is positive. When our constant is positive, that tells us that we are going to have the same sign on the inside of our parentheses. So our general setup is always that we are going to have 2 parentheses, and then we're thinking about factors that multiply to C but add to B. So we'll kind of get there with the examples, but having this outline is kind of helpful for you to figure out what factors to think of, because sometimes it can be a little bit confusing, especially with numbers that have a lot of factors. So when we have a plus next to our C value, that tells us we're going to have the same sign. And this symbol here tells us if both of them are going to be positive or both are going to be negative. So in this case, we would have both positive values, and then in our second case, we would have both negative values. And then we would just fill in our parentheses. The other 2 cases, again, are like similar to each other in the sense that our C values are both going to be negatives. So these are our other 2 cases. And this tells us that we are going to have opposite signs on the inside of our parentheses. So one is going to be a plus and one is going to be a minus. And depending on whether or not you have a positive in your middle term or a negative in your middle term is going to dictate where you put each of the factors. So this kind of probably sounds all really confusing because we haven't gone over any examples yet. But as we go through the examples, I think that this part will become more clear. The other thing I wanted to introduce was the multiplying cross. So there are some teachers that use this and some teachers that don't. So I'm just going to show you both ways and you can pick whichever way you prefer. The multiplying cross helps us kind of organize our work. So at the top we have AC and at the bottom we have B. And this is consistent through all of the different quadratic factoring types. So like even if we're factoring with a quadratic that does not have a leading coefficient of 1, which will be in our next video, we'll still use our factoring cross in the same way. As a reminder, we know that the standard form for quadratics is ax squared plus bx plus c. So our a and c value refer to our very first number and our very last number. Because we're factoring with quadratics that have a leading coefficient of 1, our a value is always going to be 1. So in this case, it would be like the 1 here times 12. So 1 times 12 gives us 12. And then our b value is our 7 here. So now we're thinking of numbers that multiply to 12, but in this case, add to 7. So remember when you have a case where C is positive here, that tells you that you are going to be adding your factors. When you have a case where C is negative, that tells you you're going to be subtracting your factors. So that's really the primary reason that we would want to know this kind of like pattern or familiarize ourselves with this type of pattern. So adding our factors here, and this is because C is positive. So let me actually change the color so it kind of all corresponds. In our second set here, we would be subtracting our factors because C is negative. So our general setup, again, is just to have our 2 sets of parentheses. We're going to have x times x to give us our x squared. We know that we're going to have pluses between because our second term is positive and our C value is also positive. So that tells us that we're going to have the same sign. Again, we're thinking of numbers that multiply to 12 but add to 7. And that would be a 3 and a 4. 3 and 4. And this would be our final factored form. Let's go to the next example. There's one particular caveat with these types that we should differentiate between. So I'll get there after we go through all of the examples. So for number 2, again, we have a case where our constant is positive, That tells us we are going to have the same sign inside of our parentheses. And then because our b value is negative, that tells us we're going to have negatives between both. We have our x and our x. It's going to give us x squared. So a lot of people like the factoring cross because it helps organize their thoughts. If you feel like you don't need it, you can also just think to yourself, like, what numbers multiply to 24 and add to 11? So that would be 8 and 3. Let's go to our next example. So again, our general setup is just something like this. And then in this case, our C value is negative. Our constant is negative here. So that tells us we're going to have one positive and one negative. So I'm just going to go ahead and put that in. We're going to have one positive, one negative. Our thinking is still the same. So what numbers multiply to 15, but subtract, because this is a negative, subtract to 2. So that would be 5 and 3. So we have to think, do we want 5 minus 3 or 3 minus 5? And that's going to dictate where we put each of our numbers. We want 5 minus 3. So we're going to put the 3 with the subtraction and then the 5 with our addition. Let's go to example number 4. I'll use the factoring cross in this case just so that we can get some practice with this guy. Again, the top is AC, the bottom is always B. In the top, again, there's technically a 1 here, so it'd be 1 times negative 10. So you do need to bring the negative with you. So we would have a negative 10 up here. 1 times negative 10. Our B value is negative 3. Remember, we have to bring our negatives with us. This time we're thinking of 5 and 2. We have to think about which one we want to be negative so that we get a negative 3. So in this case, we would have, again, 5 and 2, but we want a negative 5 so we can get this negative 3. Our general setup, and then we already determined it's going to be a negative 5 and then a positive 2. So I hope all of these examples made sense. I'm going to give you a couple to try on your own. Before we hop into the problems that you're going to do on your own, I just want to explain the difference between two types of problems. So right now we're factoring, but there is going to be a point where it's not just going to be factoring. They're going to want you to actually solve for your x value. So I just want to distinguish the difference between having something like this and if it was set equal to 0. So for instance, if we're looking at number 4, if there is x squared minus 3x minus 10 equals 0, so even if there are no directions, you should know what this means. When you have just an expression, you are just factoring. When you have something set equal to 0, that tells you are solving for x. This process is still pretty similar. So we still have x minus 5 times x plus 2 equals 0. And then in this case, we would actually have to solve for x. So we would set each of our factors equal to 0 to find our x values. This would be a 5 and this would be a negative 2. This is not the focus of this lesson, but I did want to distinguish the difference between the two because I think it's really confusing when you have to do something that's super similar, but then there's an extra step in one and there's not an extra step in the other. And so I really want to highlight this point right now. I can make a video talking about when we would use this case in kind of like a practical sense or what you would expect the directions to be when they're asking for something like this. But again, not the focus of this video, just something I wanted to highlight because this is something I always hear is kind of confusing. Let's move to the examples. I'm just going to pop the first two up for you to take a look, and then I will go ahead and write the answers in. I hope you've taken the opportunity to pause and solve these problems. So we're going to go ahead and, again, set up our two parentheses. We have an x and an x. Our 20 is positive, and then our 9 here is also positive. So we know they're both going to be positive. We want numbers that multiply to 20 and add to 9. So we have a 5 and a 4. For number 6, again, setting up our two parentheses, our 40 is positive, so same sign. Our 13 is negative, which means that they're both going to be negative. We're thinking of numbers that multiply to 40 and add to 13. So we have an 8 and a 5. I'm going to go ahead and show you number 7 and 8. Again, take a moment to pause and go ahead and try and solve these on your own. I hope you've solved these, guys. I'm going to jump into the answers here. So we're going to set up our parentheses again. We have an x and an x. Because our 21 is negative, that tells us we're going to have opposite signs. So one is going to be positive, one is going to be negative. We want numbers that multiply to 21 and subtract to 4. So we're thinking of 7 and 3. So do we want 7 minus 3 or do we want 3 minus 7? We want 7 minus 3 to give us a positive 4. So our 7 is going to go here and then minus 3 to give us this positive 4. And our last example, we are just going to set this guy up. And then our 24 is negative. So we know they're going to be opposite signs. So we're going to go ahead and write that in. One's going to be positive, one's going to be negative. We're thinking of numbers that multiply to 24 and subtract to negative 5. So we're thinking of 8 and 3. Again, consider, do we want 8 minus 3 or do we want 3 minus 8? To get a negative 5, we want 3 minus 8. So we're going to stick the 3 over here, and then we're going to have minus 8. So I hope all of these made sense to you. I hope you got all of the examples correct. In our next video, we're going to be talking about factoring quadratics with a leading coefficient that is not equal to 1. So definitely stay tuned for that. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.